Hi, I'm Greg.
And I'm Leanne.
Welcome to Empowered Now,
where we save humanity one relationship at a time. We all struggle from time to time connecting with and understanding others and ourselves.
So we hope to encourage you to live a more authentic and empowered life by sharing what we've learned as coaches and as individuals.
Empowered Now is LGBTQ2IA, alternative lifestyle, poly, and kink friendly.
Thanks for joining us and
enjoy the show. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our episode 18, all about male vulnerability, with our special guest, Binyam. He is a fellow podcaster and an awesome human being. You can check out his podcast, Bin Checkin' In, anywhere your podcast is available. And we'll have him talk a little bit more later on about where you can find him and how you can get in touch. Does that sound good, Binyam?
Glad to be here. You guys are splendid company. This is going to be fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we're here to discuss male vulnerability, which, Greg, you've said is a topic near and dear to your heart. Do you want to address why that is?
What comes out for me when I think about vulnerability, the first thing that comes out for me when I think about vulnerability almost every single time is I cannot think of a situation where I've been vulnerable and it hasn't improved the situation. And so this idea of male vulnerability and this idea that as men, we need to but we need to continue to squash down those parts of us that are perceived as weak or vulnerable in some cases it doesn't really serve us. It doesn't serve me, certainly, and it hasn't served me because I don't know about you, Binyam, but I've tried to stuff myself into that man box repeatedly, and I've ended up really fucking miserable almost every single time. And it's not to say that being a man is miserable, but being a man under certain constructs that don't allow for the full scope and spectrum of manhood and masculinity it can be quite miserable for a lot of people. And I think that's where the vulnerability comes into play. And I think that's where we need to learn to step into the uncomfortableness of vulnerability and show and express our emotions. Because that's where the real connection and real growth and real opportunity is.
That's great. So, Binyam, I am a listener of your podcast, and I have really appreciated how you've shown up in this particular way quite publicly. Do you want to talk about why that's important to you?
I find it interesting how you put that question too, Leanne. You're saying, I've done this intentionally in a public way, which seems noteworthy. And that's the unfortunate part, I think, that Greg and I are sort of referencing, saying it seems inaccessible in some way. I remember when I watched someone else being vulnerable for the first time, and what a beautiful thing it was. I was observing and I was being a part of this ethos that he was creating as he was sharing his vulnerable share as a guy. And as I was listening in and enjoying the moment, I was thinking, I wish I had access to that. And so there's, like Greg was saying, something in our evolution, in our environment, in our makeup that sort of missed this beat here that leaves so many of us guys sort of outside the sphere of what is enjoyed within this context of vulnerability appropriately shared. And when it is on display, it's a beautiful thing to watch, but it's, again, one of those things that there's such a vacuum, it seems, to help guys to think through how can we access this, how can we learn our way into it, and how can we start practicing it in the midst. There's just that vacuum there. And so I, in this season of life, have come through a lot of valleys and peaks along the way that have maybe opened up some thresholds to enable me to experience it. I've had access to resources. Another part is really knowing where to look for resources too, right? To see how can one grow into it. But with where I have influence now, I want it to be intentional, Leanne, about modeling what it could look like and also normalizing it. Now, it might seem like I'm swimming against the tide here, but it's worthwhile as you sort of put forth these opportunities to say, this is actually something worthwhile talking about, modeling, and encouraging, because the outcome is actually for your good. In some sense, I would say it's a way of becoming more human in your existence as a human being. Whereas once upon a time, we've been locked off from so many of these expressions in the vulnerability category. having access to it almost brings a fuller flavor to savor in your experience as a human being.
I like that. I like the fuller flavor to savor. Ooh.
Yeah, me too. I really and I really like that too, because it also talks about the fact that it's there whether we want it to be or not.
Yeah.
And to experience the full spectrum of humanness, we have to embrace that. And I'm reminded of, I was on a Facebook post or in a Facebook group, and one of the guys in the Facebook group posted that men are allowed to meme, and there's many different variations of it, but men cry too, men are allowed to be vulnerable, men are allowed to have emotions, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember several of the comments in there were like, men can't do this, and men don't do this, and you're not a man if you do this, and all this other stuff. The reality is that we still do it. It's still there. Those feelings and those emotions are there, and they need to be expressed, right? As part of the human expression. And as you said, the flavor to savor, right? Because there is so much strength in that. There, and you mentioned earlier too about witnessing it from other people. I'm a huge music fan, like huge. I'm a giant music nerd. And the vulnerability inherent in being a musician, the vulnerability inherent in even the heaviest of music, in putting yourself out there for criticism and for fodder for other people, it's huge, right? And Leanne, as an actor and stuff, you can appreciate that, right? And we see, these people on the screen, if you're into the Fast and Furious movies, and if you're into the typical, sort of chest pounding man style films, which I love, don't get me wrong, there's still a vulnerability to them. And that's what connects us. That's what draws us into the film, because we're connecting to it in some way, right? And the only way we can connect is by showing up vulnerably. Everything else is disconnection. Everything else is circumstance.
I like what you were saying there too about the disconnection piece. It's almost like you're holding yourself back from part of what makes you human. And it might sound extreme, but I use the word dehumanizing. Dehumanizing, basically taking away from that full extent of expression, like you're referencing. The other part I was thinking about while you were talking there, Greg, is this paradox. It seems like a paradox to me. There is a certain product of masculinity that is sold, that is really popular today, that most are buying into. They're saying this is what the expression looks like to be masculine. This is what is identified as masculine. The paradox, however, is that whereas this representation that's sold of masculinity presents strength and brutality and so on, and all that's encompassed, it takes a lot of courage to be able to, for a guy, express and experience vulnerability. It takes massive courage to be able to say, let me touch into the feely part of my human existence, whereby it doesn't look like I have it put together. Do you know what I'm saying? Whereby expressions of vulnerability, which are perceived as weakness when you're crying, when you're talking about emotions and so on like that, you're told, come on, grow up. Those are the very, very things that actually require a lot of strength internally to be able to put on display. And therein is that paradox that I wonder how many of us are really struggling with, especially those who are trying to figure out, how do I identify with that full broad spectrum of what is available and healthy and necessary for us to express emotionally, especially the ones that are the uncomfortable ones.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I think there is that paradox. I think that like you said, that we're fed a certain sort of diet of what masculinity should be, and it's slowly changing, but there's still a lot of male identifying folks out there who struggle with the emotions. And it's not that we struggle with all emotions, because certain emotions are perfectly acceptable, like anger and aggression, and the ones that are perceived as being powerful and strong and stuff. My mind's drawing a blank at the moment, but you know what I mean, right? Like those there are certain emotions that we can express as men.
Enthusiasm,
but
joy.
even joy and enthusiasm. It's interesting that you say that, because that's a good point, because even joy and enthusiasm can be seen as vulnerabilities and weak. Like if we're too enthusiastic,
Mm.
then the other men around us are going to be intimidated by that.
Right.
If we're expressing too much joy about something, it's like, oh, dude, man up, calm the fuck down, man. It's not that big of a deal, really, right? And we have to be more stoic about it, almost.
Unless it's sports.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, true. Yeah,
or a
true.
concert. You're allowed there.
Or a
in
Marvel
those,
movie, you know?
Yeah,
But,
in those
like,
venues, right?
yeah, but in certain environments, and it's actually, it's funny because we talk about that connection piece and that paradox, right? And
Yeah.
I was going down the rabbit hole of YouTube or TikToks. I think it was TikTok, actually. TikTok is dangerous, man. Anyway.
Oh, Binyam's a big TikToker. Are
He
you
is
still
a
on
big
TikTok?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, he's a
love
huge
it.
TikToker. Look him up. Just be warned, you're going to spend a lot of time there. So days go by. What the fuck? Where did it go? It's Friday. I woke up Monday. What do you mean? You've been TikToking again, haven't you?
Yes.
And I'm not a TikToker. I watch them. I don't have the vulnerability. I don't have the courage to put myself out there that way yet. So anyway, I was watching this TikTok, and this comedian was on one of the late night shows, and he was talking about, male expressions of love with other men. And it's great. It was hilarious because he's like, you get drunk with your bros, and you grab them by the neck and you go, I love you, man. I love you. You're the best human being on the planet. I love you. And you pledge your love to this other man, right? And he's like, could you imagine doing that as your wedding vows? How would that go over? It's true though, because there are certain ways that that are acceptable to express those kinds of joy, right, that you talk about, enthusiasm, right? But if the expression of joy or enthusiasm is, oh my God, I did such a fantastic job with this today, and I was so scared of doing that, but I went through that fear anyway, and I stepped into it anyway, and it was such an amazing turnout, and I felt so connected to everybody. Bros are going to be looking at you like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, calm down, dude, chill. And a lot of that is because I'm going to speak for me, feel intimidated by that. That's uncomfortable. We don't know what to do with that, but we know what to do with the I love you, bro stuff, right? Because that's, for some reason, easier. It's been programmed into us to be easier.
As I look at that breakdown of what you're doing there as the guys do that, one, I'm thinking about how much alcohol plays a part when they're expressing those emotions.
Yes.
So there's a lack of inhibition, right? But even in that expression of enthusiastic, I love you, man, kind of thing, is also something that is, here's the way I'm going to express this desire, but still camouflage it with masculinity. You're beating
the chest beating stuff,
as
right?
opposed to the one that's more, hey, I just want you to know in this solemn moment, you really mean a lot to me, kind of thing. That's a little more awkward again, because it gets a little close to the bared vulnerability that has to in some way be couched with that strength category, like just and say it. I remember
aggression. It's aggressive.
There is that element. Absolutely.
Aggression is a much easier expression as a man than caring or love. And it's interesting that you say that, because I think about that, and I think about, like, humor plays a big role in that too, right? As another way to mask that, oh, I love you, man, like that Bud Light commercial from years ago, right? And so anytime, and what's interesting to me is when we step into those things, when we step into that aggression and we step into that humor and stuff, the emotion underneath is still there. You're still expressing appreciation and love and joy and enthusiasm and all of that stuff, but you're doing it in a safer way, in a more accepted way, inside that, what Tony Porter calls man box, right? But if you were to look at your friend, or you in this case, and I were to say to you, and I've said this to you, and I've said this to many male friends, I really appreciate you. That is like, whoa, what are you talking about? Like, you want to have butt sex with me? What's going on here? Like, what are you doing? Like, it really taps into that vulnerability, right?
Well, and not only that, if you add in things like close proximity, lack of alcohol and eye contact, all of it becomes a different kind of experience.
It becomes very intimate.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's the word.
Yeah. I remember years ago when I was getting ready to go work on the oil rigs. My brothers had already been on the rigs before I was. And so they were very concerned for my safety. And so they sat me down very solemnly beforehand and said, Binyam, you need to realize you can't be your Eunice on the rigs because they're going to just have you for dinner. And my Eunice being just being kind, just the way I am. And so I was thinking about this as I was driving to my first lease. As I drove on there and walked into the mess hall where I was going to meet the rest of the guys, I was sort of stressed about all this. I got to like show strength and stoicism that you were mentioning earlier. And I walked in and instantaneously I saw people. And what I usually respond to when I see people is a huge smile and like a big wave kind of thing, because they're all looking at who's the new guy. And in that moment is when I realized, oh crap, I just gave up the poker face, that I was supposed to come forward with. And I could see all these knowing looks all of a sudden saying, oh, is this kind of a weak person that we have at our disposal now kind of thing, right? And I mean, it was a very rough few months initiation into the rigs. Eventually, I was able to find my stride and still keep my meanness. I never wanted to shift or change, right? And but it was, again, that same sense you're talking about, Greg, of this collective signed on, we operate under this mandate that keeps us off limits on this whole vulnerability zone, because that's not to be even brought into the same sentence as masculinity. Masculinity and vulnerability, like what do they have to do with each other? It's like oil and water. Like, why are we talking about this?
Right. That's interesting. I like that.
Yeah.
So something that I'm thinking about as you're talking about that is the environment, right? So we're talking about some environments, there's places where it's safer. Some times or situations like when you've been drinking that allows for the expression to be safer. And then there's also,
Well, I want to point something out about the drinking though, because I think what happens is it lowers our inhibitions, right? It lowers, it brings down those walls, that we're choosing to be behind.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what the alcohol does. And I think music a lot of the times can do the same thing. And so shared experiences can do the same thing as well. So I think that's what, I don't know why I keep doing this with my hand. Sorry. But
don't know.
Yeah.
So, but what you're saying is what Binyam was saying earlier, the filter is gone and that's what's dropping. The wall is falling down. Right. Even if it's just temporarily. Yeah. And substance induced.
Right.
Yeah. The other part you were referencing earlier, which I found really profound, Greg, you were saying we do express these emotions. We just maybe not do it in public, which gets me on Leanne's point here of saying vulnerability or expressions of vulnerability. Okay, if we do it in our own privacy, in the privacy of our own rooms or in front of the mirror or whatever, there's something that maybe you're more willing to say, okay, I'm willing to sit with this thought now or this idea that makes me feel vulnerable when you're by yourself. But it seems the extension of doing this in community, which most of us are in the context in some sense of, whether it's in a relationship with your significant other or whether it's amongst your guy friends or in a mixed crowd, what does that look like? There's ways in which we walk out of our homes from behind closed doors into public presentation that we feel and say, this is what I want to reflect me. Here's how I want to present. And that's, I think, the part that is really intriguing about this conversation is not that we don't express vulnerability. If it's true what you're saying, Greg, that we all do express it in some sense, whether it's in our own bedroom under the covers and we're like, okay, now I can really crawl up in a way that no one ever knows I do because I feel vulnerable at this moment, versus, okay, once I step out of my room now, I'm going to put on this display for my family, for my community, for my group that I spend time with that shows this is what it looks like to be a man. Interesting.
Yeah, Lewis Howes actually, Howes, Lewis Howes has a book called The Mask of Masculinity. And he talks about exactly that, the different masks that we put on as men and how we think they serve us versus what they're actually doing or not doing for us. And it's really interesting to me that you talk about that, because as somebody who has struggled with my emotional regulation my entire life, and who is a highly sensitive person, me, a man, I have learned to put those masks on. And even as you're talking about that, I'm thinking, what does my mask look like? Well, my mask looks like the tattoos, the piercings, the beard, the heavy metal t-shirts,
shaved head,
right? Well, the shaved head is more of a necessity because really nobody wants to see that fuzz anyway. But yeah, it's all of that. It really is all of that. And it's a protective mechanism. It's something I like about myself. I look good this way. I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm just saying that it's developed over the years because I wanted to be perceived in a certain light by the general public. But if you get to know me, there's that paradox, right? You know, you see me on the street walking down, and chances are you might want to cross the street based upon what you see. But as soon as we smile, or as soon as we open our mouths and start talking and communicating, I can't tell you. Actually, it's interesting. I was about ready to put a caveat in and say, I'm not trying to talk about, I'm not trying to build myself up here, but actually, I'm not going to say that, because this is a fact. And this is something I feel really good about. I get a lot of people telling me that when they actually start talking to me and they find out that I am not the things that they perceive me to be, it's a welcome relief.
Let me just pause you there. That was an expression of vulnerability that I think is worthwhile noting, because on the one hand, masculinity is very bravado, like, look at me kind of thing, right? And then there's the other sense that most of us would come from that says, let me not try to make myself look good. You know, let me try to be humble in some sense.
Yeah.
But something to be said about actually being honest about some of our strengths, saying, hey, I'm really good at this. Even if people may walk away thinking that, oh, look at him, he's all, you know, show off or whatever. It's that element, Greg, of say, I can acknowledge this, and I don't have to feel bad about that, even though it might be perceived this way. Therein is a vulnerability that you're willing to put on display and saying, hey, I'm centering on here first before I extend myself about how I perceive myself in a way that this is okay. This is a good thing. So I love that display there. That was awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think that's part of the learning process for me. And I think that's part of what draws people to me, frankly. Is that willingness to step into that and to acknowledge those thoughts and those feelings as they come up. And it's, you know, what's the phrase I'm looking for? It's it's not talking yourself up, but help me out here, honey. What's the phrase? Is when you self-aggrandizing or whatever, right? Yeah,
you know, when you're tooting your own horn.
Tooting your own horn. There we go. So yeah, what I was going to say was, I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but frankly, I am fucking trying to toot my own horn because my own horn deserves to be toot.
Absolutely.
But it's interesting to me, and I think, you know, what you're picking up here, Binyam, is that there was a struggle, right? And so there was a moment where you were like, should I? No. And then you had to push through. And even in describing that moment, you're, you know, using the F-bomb and stuff like that in that sort of aggressive way to kind of make yourself feel comfortable. Right. And so that's all very, you know, sort of part of the conversation here is the lived experience that you both go through daily in being vulnerable men, right? Which personally I really appreciate. And I learn a lot about vulnerability from watching people like you, myself, even without being male. You know, the struggle to be vulnerable is real for all of us. But yeah, so that was really interesting to me.
Part of that contrast, I think that's brilliant in this podcast, for example. I remember the first time we met, and I was really intrigued by both of you, really intrigued. And I remember touching base with you, Greg. We had a mini conversation on this topic in that first engagement. And I'm not sure if you remember this, but I still remember it. I'm like, you and I do not look the same. You are the man's man, kind of thing, right? And here I am representing my team. Woohoo! And, so even as you just shared from your background, I was thinking of the contrast from mine. From a very early age, that's like my preteens into my teens, I had the opportunity to align with a masculine mold that was presented for me. And back then, what that meant for me was, you're going to go to the gym, you're going to get buff, right? You're going to operate in a certain way, in the way you socially engage. You're going to be like stoic, you're going to be indifferent, you're going to be distant emotionally. So all those things, I watched that presentation of what I could be a part of. And I think for me at that point, I valued far more the emotional and relational connections with people. I wanted to keep very much in tune with that. So whereas you were on a different plane, I was in another zone over here. And I saw that trajectory that I took in a different direction that I didn't really resonate or fit in with most of the guys, even though they respected and, we could still interact. I just wasn't at that place. My brothers, for example, they're bigger physically than I am, and I'm the oldest of all my siblings, kind of thing. You know what I'm saying? But all this to say, where I'm presently at right now and where that's led me, it's been interesting. People, when they observe me, there's a variety of ways that they perceive me on first impression. One of those that I'll often get asked is, are you either bisexual or homosexual? Which in the masculine conversation we're talking about are two taboos. It is not cool to be perceived as to be seen as homosexual or bisexual if you're trying to push forth this masculine, like I'm a man's man kind of thing, and I love those opportunities to be able to say, well, no, I'm not either bisexual or homosexual. I'm definitely heterosexual, but let's talk about those perceptions and the way we carry ourselves. And when we're talking about male vulnerability, again, this detracts from that common theme of what masculinity today looks like. We're looking at evidences of weakness in the context of someone who has a penis, right? And what does that convey to others? And you think about the way you dress, for example, or the way you're soft-spoken, or the way you're in touch with your emotions, these things that detract from masculinity, which we're saying that's worthwhile challenging.
I'm just going to
pause,
bring something up, which is, and I know that, Greg, you mentioned it earlier, let's not focus on having a penis. Let's focus on, this is the experience for anyone who is identifying and expressing masculinity, right? So male identifying or masculine expressing people all encounter the same kinds of biases about vulnerability, right? And so it's really important to put that forward in the conversation. It's not just about your penis, it's about, you're a man. And we actually had a very interesting discussion with someone who came to one of Greg's male vulnerability talks a few years ago, a trans male who could sort of assess the change in the world around them as they came out as trans male and started to express masculine traits.
What a perspective.
Yeah, and the expectation shifted from, you're okay to be emotional here as a female presenting person. And as soon as they transitioned, that's got to stop, right? And that was a message that got very clearly given to them by friends and family and society at large. And that's what you're talking about, is this sort of onslaught of like, you can't. And the irony here in this very conversation about sexuality and how you present and how people assume things about your sexuality. Greg, do you want to speak to your sexuality in this?
Well, actually, I want to speak to a couple of things, but that comes up as interesting to me because when you put, I'll use you and I as an example. When you put the two of us up next to each other, and those assumptions and those preconceived notions start to come up based upon traditional masculine programming, most people, and I'm not saying all, but I'm saying most people are going to make certain assumptions about your sexuality, as you've mentioned, which is that you're either homosexual or bisexual. And most people are going to make different assumptions about me, which is that I'm completely heterosexual. The interesting thing about it is that it's actually swapped because I am bisexual.
Yes.
And you are not.
Yes.
So it's and frankly, I love that because I love that surprise. It's like, surprise, told you, motherfucker. So I really like that. And there's that humor and that F-bomb thing again to mask that vulnerability, right? Because that does feel uncomfortable for me sometimes admitting that. But it's interesting to me because when you sift through all of that and you allow for the humanness to fall through, what really comes up is it doesn't really matter. None of it matters. What matters is this connection. And Leanne, you mentioned something earlier about, well, actually, I'm going to circle back to the trans man that was in the room. And this is a moment that I will never forget. And I don't know if it's the same person, because I know there were a couple of trans people in the room at the time at this particular talk. But I remember that this one trans man raised his hand and he said, what does it mean to be a man? Do you remember this moment, Leanne?
I do.
He said, "What does it mean to be a man?" And, you know, I looked at him without missing a beat. I said, "Whatever the fuck you want it to mean." And ultimately, that's what it is masculinity is whatever we want it to be for ourselves as individuals. I look at you and I see a very strong masculine man. I see somebody who has come to understand the strength that's inherent in emotions, and I consider you to be a good friend. And I'll be honest with you, the first time I met you that night, I had those really great conversations, but I was like, fuck, that guy asks a lot of questions. And I found it a little unnerving because it felt vulnerable to me in a very social situation, which is by if you know me, you know that I'm not the most social person. I'm more of an introvert. And so to step into those environments, especially into an environment where I don't know anyone, right? And then, I mean, I knew a few people, but then have this guy who, and I was making assumptions too. Like I wasn't guilt-free of those assumptions. I was making assumptions. I was like, God damn, that's a fantastic bow tie, but is he gay? You know, and if he is, maybe we can hang out. But but you know what I mean? Like there was all sorts of stuff happening for me in that moment that weren't just about connecting human to human. There was a lot of bias and a lot of deprogramming that I had to do in the moment in order to get past those things and connect with you as a man.
Sure.
You know, and I think that's where that work of vulnerability becomes a strength. Right. Yeah. And before you say something else, I want to touch on something that you said earlier, Leanne. You said, as a woman, I appreciate this vulnerability, and you learned a lot from it. If there is a man that's listening to this right now, or a male identifying human being is listening to this right now, and you take absolutely nothing else away from this, nothing else at all, take this away and own it, put it in your heart, love it, accept it, rub it, treat it with kindness, feed it, pet it, and let it grow, because this is a truth. The truth is that every single person that you want to date, you want to have sex with, that you want to connect with, that you want to be with on some level, wants to see the vulnerability, wants to see the emotional responses, wants to see the compassion and the kindness and the love and the caring. Because that's what connects us, right? There's life-protecting emotions and there's life-giving emotions. Life-protecting emotions are fear and anger and frustration. Life-giving emotions are compassion and love and kindness and peace and joy, right? And they're called life-giving because they give us life and they connect us. And so the next time you're out on a date, or the next time you're sitting at home and you're wondering, why the fuck don't I have any girlfriends, or why doesn't anybody like me? Maybe take a look at the way your masculinity is showing up. Maybe take a look at the way that your programming, your biases about masculinity are inhibiting you from being able to step into vulnerability and true, genuine, authentic connection with other human beings.
I like that.
I can see that you have something to share, Binyam, so I'll pass it over to you. And then I'm going to speak to that too, I think. Yeah.
You can speak to that first, Leanne. Go ahead and speak to that first.
Are you sure?
I wrote my points down here. I'm like, oh,
so did I.
I'd love to hear you.
Okay, so there's a couple things. There's a couple of things that came up for me when I heard you talking. First of all, I don't think it's true that all women are open to vulnerable men. Women buy in just as much as men do to the expectations of the man box in many, many ways, and hold men in there, sometimes ruthlessly. And I need to speak to my female identifying friends out there who are listening, who need to hear that message. If we want connection, and that's what we're ultimately talking about through vulnerability, if we want true connection with someone, we are going to have to be open to their vulnerable self. And if we are not there yet, we have work to do. And holding someone to these expectations of you cannot have emotions. You have to be stoic. You have to be strong all the time. You can't cry. You can't show me that side of yourself, is damaging. It's hurtful. And as, people in the world, just on the planet, sharing space with others, we have no place doing that to anybody else, in my personal opinion. And also as caregivers, parents, we do the same thing to our little ones. And we genderize conversations, and we weaponize gender, and we take away toys because they're not, appropriate for a gender to play with. That kind of thing starts so young and is so damaging. We really need to get away from it. So that's my little spiel about that. The second thing that came up for me was, I know that it's hard to talk about. I'm laughing because I'm feeling vulnerable. I know that it's hard to hold space sometimes for someone being vulnerable, right? Sometimes you're feeling vulnerable. You want someone in your world to be strong, and you turn to someone for strength, and they are being vulnerable right back. And you feel like you're kind of in this, lake of vulnerability together. Who's being strong here? It's okay to dive in and to swim together and to let that happen. And you don't always need strength to be the driving force or the sought out quality that will get you through something. I think that's a real mistake that we make a lot. I have to be strong to get through this. And in fact, you don't necessarily. In some cases, maybe there is some survival things that you have to tend to, right? If we're fighting a war, or we're, in an abusive relationship, or we're struggling for food security. Yeah, there's some things that we have to do in order to address the basic needs so that we survive. And we have to be strong maybe for those things. But then once our basic needs are taken care of, it's okay to swim in the pool of vulnerability together and not necessarily strive for strength.
That's good.
Thank you.
Yeah,
for
you're
that.
welcome.
I wrote down just a few words here, and this is sort of following up on what you were saying there, Greg. I love the analogy used of surprise. When you are meeting someone, there are preconceived ways that we've been taught to read someone, or read the book by the cover and say, okay, this person's wearing this, so I'm going to put them in this category, without ever giving them the courtesy of saying, who are you? And let me give you your voice back so that you can tell me how you present yourself and what's important to you, and so on going forward. So I love that box of chocolates element, where you're opening it up and you don't know what you're going to get. But if we couldn't but give that same courtesy to one another in the way that we engage socially. And what that does is basically, we're touching on this topic again because the prevalence of struggle, especially amongst those male identifying or males, and saying, how do I sort of like go through this confusion? It's like literally confusion of, I'm expected to be this way, but their body's crying out for this. And so how do you bring reconciliation between the two of them to be who you truly are? And let that surprise not only be for yourself, but for those who are in your life. I love that dynamic. But the biggest gift, I would argue, Greg, is how can we give ourselves to others, not parts of ourselves, because other parts feel like they're off limits because that's what people are not going to like about you. But how can you bring your full self to those that you share life with? Because that's the real gift there, when they know how you feel, what is really important to you, how you now, like, how do you see your worldview in essence? When you can have full access to that and then be able to feel safe enough in those contexts to share that with those in your life that are really important, then you get the connection piece. You get the connection piece because I know what it's like when I played a different presentation of what was expected of me in my former community. And I was like, okay, this is what their expectations are, but I wish they could really know who the real Binyam is. But if I really show who the real Binyam is, I'm going to be cast out because there's parts of me that they don't like. So how would we be able to present the full Binyam And then know that as I'm presenting all of this, this is a gift that I'm giving to them that requires communication that has access to knowing how to express everything on the inside externally. There's a beautiful realignment that happens for one when they are not having to do the dance of saying, I know what I'm like on the inside, but I hope no one out externally ever finds out. It's a beautiful thing when you can say the real me on the inside can be the real me on the outside, and I can be in the community that accepts me for all that I am. That's why I think that's a really important component of this conversation in male vulnerability, because it's like male identifying are saying there's a significant part of me that I can't express. And so I feel less than, I feel like there's only a part of me that people really know, in which case I can't connect fully. It's a beautiful thing when you can connect fully because you have access to all the parts and you can share that through communication to those in your world, a really important component. And then the follow-up with you, Leanne, I love what you're saying about how even on the feminine identifying side, there are those expectations that, and this is where I was really helped by one of the books we'll talk about at the end here, of saying that there are women who are like, yeah, I want vulnerability, but when it's on display, oh no, I don't want that. That's no, I want my rock solid, impenetrable, solid, male identifying or male individual in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And this crosses the board for anyone who's on the receiving end of vulnerability. Let's say someone comes into your life and they share something pretty raw and vulnerable, and you're uncomfortable with vulnerability. You're like, oh crap, what do we do? Things just got real, right? And I can understand that. I can understand that reception because maybe you haven't had that practice to be able to sit in those spaces where things get really real, and maybe just a simple, I'd love to hear you guys' assessment on what you would say to those individuals who are uncomfortable. For my part, I would just say the real part is to sit in that moment with them without feeling the pressure to respond in a certain way or say the right thing. Just being there and present in the moment with them, being attentive, not having to really say anything. And even after they've been able to unload and process and share all that, just a simple thank you for sharing that. That was really important. And I value that is something that just does lots for that individual by way of healing, by way of affirming, by way of acknowledging, by way of just a lot of good things on the inside that someone didn't give them the answers that they're looking for. That wasn't what they're probably looking for. They just wanted someone to know, hey, here's where I'm at. Were you able to be strong enough to handle the real me? And just being there is a significant gift, again, that you can extend.
Yeah. Thank you is huge. I use that a lot. And I've gotten some feedback from people that say that they appreciate it. Because oftentimes it's not about, you're being a receptor to that information. And it's not really about, providing an opinion or fixing something, right? Which again, talking about masculinity and the vulnerability of or the strength that's inherent in masculinity is we're fixers, right? That's one of the programming things that we have is that we have to fix everything. So if our partner comes to us and says, hey, I have this problem, well, I don't know about you, Binyam, but I want to fix it. That's where my head goes first. And then I have to remind myself that it's not my job to fix it. And so then I have to remind myself that this is a gift that this person is giving to me. And so I have to show graciousness for that gift. I have to show gratitude for it and say, thank you, right? That's the way I honor that person and their willingness to show up vulnerably for me. Right. And so so my answer to your question about, how would I do it? I do it the exact same way. Yeah. I would say, thank you. And it can be uncomfortable. And the other thing too, to keep in mind is that it's relationship or contextually dependent too, right? It's easier to do it with certain relationships than it is to do it with others, depending upon the level of intimacy that you have with that relationship. Like for instance, it would be way easier for me to do that with you than it would be for me to do that with Leanne. And it also depends on the subject. Are you the subject? Are you the person that they're struggling with or talking about? And if so, are you still able to hold that vulnerable space and still find the gratitude and the opportunity in it?
Oof.
Right? That's some tough shit to do.
That is really tough. Oh, right? And I can feel it. I'm tensing up just listening to that. I'd be like, oh, all the defensives are called up, right?
Yeah. And I think that transcends gender.
Yeah.
But I also think it's gender dependent in some ways because of the way we deal with it. Male identifying folks have a tendency to suppress that, or they have a tendency to take it personally. And again, I can't speak to female identifying because I've never identified as female. So for me, I've always taken that personally. It's always been somewhat of an attack against me. I'm doing something wrong. And so now I got to fix it.
Yeah.
You know, and then I have a whole, you know, whack ton of abandonment and attachment issues and wounds on top of all of that get in the way, blah, 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 but that's for a different day. But the reality is that because of the masculine programming that I was subjected to, and the fact that, you know, my Barbie dolls were taken away from me and people gave me G.I. Joes instead, tells me that I have to fix it. Right? I fucked up. I made a mistake somehow. And again, maybe that's not gender specific, but I think the way that we process it often is, because it's more acceptable for women to be vulnerable in those situations. It's more acceptable for female identifying people to express their emotions in that situation and say things like, I'm sorry you feel that way, or, you know, I hear you and how can I help you, than it is for men to say those things. Because in a man masculinity traditional role would be like, you know, well, what do you mean? I'm failing you somehow.
Right. Well, and that goes back to the cultural level, right? Our family of origin experiences, our caregiver experiences, our school-based experiences that all teach us what's okay and what's not okay behaviorally. And so for girls, you know, a lot of our aggression comes out in very passive aggressive ways. And we verbally process things and we hurt one another, not physically necessarily, although I grew up in Forest Lawn, so there was some of that. But, you know, we will, you know, get to someone socially. We'll ostracize them. That kind of tactic is utilized by young girls early on, very early on. You see it in like kindergarten. It's weird. And then boys are also encouraged and almost celebrated when they are more aggressive, when they take risks physically. You know, they climb the equipment. And it's almost like it's a conditioned response in everybody around us to push the boys further that way, and to encourage them to take the wounds, you know, the physical wounds and ignore them, you know, keep going. Whereas we coddle the girls, you know, all of that is part of our experience as a culture. And we are, I think, really messing with people's heads about what's okay. You know, I saw a meme recently about two women taking a bath together. They're back to back having a glass of wine. And somebody wrote on there, you know, I wish I could do that with my male friends. But it's just not okay. Why is it just not okay? You know, there's just that level of continual programming that you all have been subjected to basically from birth, really. And it's kind of a big task to push past, you know, to navigate around or through that. I can only imagine.
One of the words I was thinking as I was listening to both of you there is the word affirmation. I wrote the word affirmation. So there is, in social context, as we navigate socially, there's this sense that we want to be seen, we want to be acknowledged, we want to be accepted, we want to be loved, but then where this affirmation usually leads to is this synonym perhaps for vulnerability, and that is intimacy. I would almost say there's a very close relationship there. Even as we talk about connection, what does it look like to be connected, right? And how close do we get? Most of us have experienced, like you were describing there, Leanne, and Vivicolor, all those things that we have now built up walls around our hearts, around our emotions, because we've been hurt once upon a time. We've been burned in some ways. And so how do we sort of keep protected on the inside by building up these walls? And here's where this topic of male vulnerability comes up. What are the walls that we build up so that we can shield ourselves appropriately and give off this perception that is expected of strength and courage and aggressiveness and all that entails? But that intimacy is, again, a scary one because you're letting someone come really close to the core of who you are. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Those who are signing up for a version of masculinity that you, Greg, and I perhaps don't want to sign up for, they're still seeking for that intimacy from where it's safe for them, right? So they might do that by way of, trying to get the girl, have lots of sex, do all this kind of stuff along with it, that tries to in some way get as close as it can without getting too close, because that zone, that sacred zone internally, is a really scary place for one to be able to open for accessibility. Go ahead.
I wrote this down, and I'm curious to hear from you, Binyam, as well as you, both of you. Mm-hmm. What is so scary about it?
Mm-hmm. What's scary about it, I believe, is that it touches, I believe, the very core of your humanity, the way you are, when you let someone into that space that says, hey, I can actually finally be able to open up and tell you what's really going on the inside, even if I'm perceived in a less favorable light.
Okay. Yeah. So what is scary about that, though? What comes up for you when you think about that? Because I'm actually having a visceral physical reaction to that idea. So it's very scary for me.
Absolutely.
So
for me,
what are you afraid of in that environment?
The fearful part for me that I had to face through my evolution is that I'm going to lose my space in this community. I'm made to be social. I like connection. I like being connected. But to be seen as other than, to be seen as the outcast, the one who no one wants to be around. If they knew who the real Binyam was, this is how I thought once upon a time, Greg, my former community. If they actually knew the real Binyam and how messy the real Binyam is, I'm done for. And I'm going to be relegated to the outside of this community with no chance of ever being loved, cared for, thought of in the sense that says, you're still good. That was the fearful element for me, the cutoff part.
Right. And so, Leanne, what about you? When you think about that, are you comfortable sharing what you're afraid of in those things?
No, I'm uncomfortable sharing, but I'll share. That's why we're here. So
we're the guinea pigs. Yes, carry on.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about, Binyam, is the ultimate threat, is being ostracized from community, because we're tribal beings, and being ostracized equals death. It's abandonment. And for so many of us who have abandonment wounds already from our family of origin or even past relationships with as an adult, that threat it becomes life-threatening in our perception of it, even if it's not. And so safety is often perceived as barriered, protected. I'm in my castle, I'm armed, I'm safe, right? We miss out when we're in that castle on the connection piece that you're talking about, because we're not able to be in community, and we're so worried about being in community and being vulnerable or seen. And some people live there. Some people stay in their castle very happily. That's where they want to be, and they're not willing to risk outside of that, and that's okay. But I don't think they ever get to the same level of intimacy or connection, right? And so once we are able to step beyond those walls, put down our weaponry, or Greg, your analogy that you like to use is take off the armor. Remove the armor that we've been hiding behind. Yes, we will get hurt. Yep, that's gonna happen. People are going to say, hey, your armor's off. Cool. Just shoot that arrow right at you. Yeah. Or even just through circumstance, through risk. Like, it's always a risk to do that.
Right. But here's the word that keeps popping up for me as I hear you both explain that fear for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
And the word is paradox.
Okay.
And that word comes, thank you for reminding me of that word earlier, Binyam. And here's the reason that there's the paradox. And I'm hoping maybe you guys could help me reframe it from paradox into something maybe more like a duality,
Okay.
like to be able to hold both of these things at the same time. Because from a masculine perspective, which is mine, that's the perspective that I have, the paradox is that I want to keep myself, that part of me, that sweet, juicy, lovely center that I don't want any motherfuckers licking to. I want to keep that private because
Yeah.
I'm afraid, as you said, Binyam,
Yeah.
that if anybody were to see that everybody would hate me and ostracize me and not love me and abandon me. Right? So that's a universal experience. And that's the paradox, is that we all feel that way. We all have that same experience. We all have that same fear. Some of us more than others. But even, and I would suggest, I don't know, but I would suggest that maybe even the most successful, by whatever definition you describe success, even the most successful of us still have that same fear. And then in some ways, that's part of what drives them. So this idea, how do we work to reframe that as opposed to being a paradox that we all experience, because we all want that most successful person and that most, let's say, person in the castle, to use your analogy, who doesn't want to deal with anybody. I'm not saying that they're not successful, because that's not what this is about. But how does everybody, regardless of where you might be in that, how do we reframe that as a duality and then be able to hold both of those at the same time and say, you know what, I'm scared shitless of showing this part of myself to people. And I need to show myself this, as you're saying, because this is a part of who I am. And not only is it a part of me, but I would argue that it is the part of me. Right? And so how do we do that? How do we reframe that from maybe from a masculine perspective? And so my brain is working overtime right now, figuring out how can I let all of the male identifying folks out there who struggle with vulnerability, how can I let them know that it's okay to feel both of those things simultaneously? And it's okay to be scared shitless at this idea of being, using my previous analogy, being licked to your sweet core. That doesn't sound so bad, does it? It's okay to drop the armor and still be afraid to drop the armor.
So I think we should speak to the safety piece. Binyam, you noted that earlier. There's going to be places where it's safe to do that.
Yeah.
And people with whom you have come to trust to do that with, right? And so there's places where that's not going to be safe. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point too. I was thinking of bite-sized chunks, even as one is luring their way. For example, let's say one is like, this is really eye-opening. This conversation never had awareness. Where would we even encourage them? One of the things I am active about on my platforms, when I identify what I'm doing, I'm saying, hey, this is an expression of what vulnerability could look like. I'm doing it at a world stage, but please don't do what I'm doing. This would be actually really devastating and destructive for you, based on the fact that it's taken me a span of time of years to get to this point here, to be able to be comfortable with sharing my story, and to be able to also sign up for the backlash of what's going to happen from those who are like, hey, we see an opportunity to rip someone else apart here. You need to build up some significant other skills to be able to face that. So what does this look like on a safety level? I would say it is finding who are your safe people in your life that you can practice this incrementally with. It doesn't mean like pursuing unrealistically the finished, I'm going to be like Binyam or Greg or Leanne by the end of the week, as opposed opposed to saying, hey, what does it look like for me to find out and identify who are those voices in my life, whether they're professionally brought on, where you're paying for their services, or in a safe context of family or friends, who you're like, okay, I'm going to try and do this with this individual, bring them on speed, and then say, here's me trying to be able to get a little bit more to the core how to express what's going on in here. I think that's a really important piece. If that is not taken care of in discerningly identifying who those individuals are, you'll have the experience, I'm presuming, where you're going to give up way before you've even started in a helpful way because it was a bad experience, right? So doing this in community is really fantastic, but doing it in safe community. Who are those people that have earned that place of trust? Those people who have a track record of being consistent, that they are going to hold your confidences, they are going to be able to hold that space for you, and that you've communicated with them saying, are you willing to sign on this way here? Because it's going to take a two-way street where they are going to have to be willing to sit down with you and say, okay, let me give you some feedback here. Let me help you along this process. That's also really important too.
And I also think further to that, that's a great point too, by the way. I also think further to that, not only is the feedback, but we talked earlier about being able to hold that safe space. And so maybe not necessarily providing feedback. Find those people that are just willing to sit there and listen and be receptors to whatever it is that you're saying and absorb it. And be witness to your vulnerability, as opposed to, needing feedback from it. Because oftentimes, I don't know, I mean, my experience has been that oftentimes I just want to be heard, right? I just want to be heard. I don't need somebody to fix it. I don't necessarily need somebody to reaffirm or give me reassurances that I'm doing okay. I just need to say it, or, right? And so maybe there's some of that too. When you're looking at your community of safe people, who are the people in your community that you feel can hold that space for you without judgment? And then maybe if you're one of those people like me who just needs to be heard without the need for feedback, and they can just simply see you and be witness to you in whatever ways that looks like.
Yeah. The beautiful thing, even as we're addressing this point that you're asking us, Leanne, is this is across the board for male identifying, female, like for anyone who's human being. And yet we're focusing on this specific topic today of male vulnerability, almost as a way of saying collectively, stereotypically, as far as those who are male identifying, we have this struggle of actually getting to this place of saying, what does that look like to express appropriately vulnerability, just like anyone else would, but uniquely from the stereotype that we are burdened to try and live up to or live according to, and saying, how can you, like you were saying, Greg, screw that cookie cutter model and be who you are, present as you are, take that on in a certain sense, and almost, if you're looking for permission, this is a sign. You have permission to start exploring who you are outside of those external categorizations that say this is what each should.
But like you were saying, especially when it comes to male vulnerability, make sure you're doing that in a safe space. Because the world, as unfortunate as it might be, the world isn't ready to receive that on a grand scale yet. And so unless you've built up a thicker skin and you've got tools in your toolkit that will enable you to be able to manage and navigate through the criticisms that are going to come up, I wouldn't do it publicly. No.
In which case, it brings me back again to one of the first places we started. This takes guts.
It takes vulnerability to be vulnerable. Right?
Yeah. Oh, this has been such a good conversation. Sorry, did you have something else, Greg?
Well, I was just going to say that one of the sort of what's the word I'm looking for? One of the foundations in the work that I've done with male vulnerability is this idea of reframing strength, right? And what strength looks like. And so I just want to make a comment about it in this environment, because I think it's really important, because strength is such a big component of masculinity, right? Physical strength, mental acuity, that stuff. But what we don't think about oftentimes is our emotional intelligence and the emotional strength that it often takes. And when we do, in the framework of masculinity, think about it, we think about it from the perspective of what we're not expressing, right? So what we're suppressing or being stoic about, right? my suggestion is that maybe we work on reframing strength from a vulnerable, from an emotional perspective as vulnerability, because ultimately it takes a massive amount of courage to be vulnerable. It takes a massive amount of courage to take that armor off one piece at a time and to show up in that way with the people that you trust and care about and that have earned that from in your life, right? And so along with physical strength, along with physical strength and intellectual acuity and all of that other stuff, there's this emotional IQ, right? That we need to develop. And it's got to be a full spectrum of emotions. It can't just be certain emotions.
Right, because when it is just certain emotions, what we end up with is acting out aggressively because that's the only outlet, right? Or depression, which is essentially anger turned inwards, right? And so the anger is the thing that I think a lot of people come to hang their hat on as the acceptable emotion when I'm in struggle, but not tears, not opening yourself up to someone else and verbally allowing them in, or even just silently allowing them in, letting them be with you when you are in struggle and not deviating over to anger because that's the acceptable norm, right?
Or showing anger in a healthy and more compassionate way.
Anger is a valid emotion.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not that it's being compassionate with your anger. It's being, it's being kind in your anger, because you're entitled to be angry about something. Somebody's done you wrong, so to speak, whatever that might mean to you. You're entitled to feel angry. What you're not entitled to do is be an asshole with that anger. Right? That's where it becomes a problem. And that's where that toxic programming comes into play. Right. And that's where I think we need to start stepping outside of that box. And if anybody's listening and they want to do more research on it, a guy named Tony Porter, he's got this thing called the man box culture. And I highly recommend reading up on it and doing the research on it and stuff, because it was really informative in my work. And I don't want to get too much into detail about it, but it's been really informative in my work. And if you're a visual thinker like I am, it really helps me to say, okay, am I trying to stay in this box, or am I trying to be true to myself here? Because they're two very different things in most cases.
Binyam, before we were recording, you mentioned something about Renee Brown. Do you remember what that was? How that relates? Okay. Do you mind sharing that?
Yeah. So this book had a similar theme to her previous books. It's called Men, Women, and Worthiness. Men, Women, and Worthiness. And I really benefited from that book. This is a book where she was sharing a little bit about how her research had primarily been centered especially on women and vulnerability and worthiness. But one of her conference attendees, her husband, came up with her to meet Renee, and then he kind of stuck around afterwards, and then he said, this is all great, but it's also, how did he say, it seems to work really well for you that you only deal with women, but you don't help men in this area. And so that began her branch out and saying, oh, what does this look like for men? And some of the things you were talking about, Greg, were touching on that. Go ahead.
So I wanted to expand on that story because I read the same story in her book, Daring Greatly. And that was actually the beginning of my journey into vulnerability, was the work that Renee Brown did. And in that story, the one thing, and I actually still to this day, some 10 years later after reading the book, get goosebumps when I think about the story. And the story is that, like you were saying, this elderly man who came with his wife and his two daughters to one of Renee Brown's talks, comes up to her afterwards and says, I noticed that you only work with women. Why is that? And then Renee, in her vulnerability, says in the book that she got scared shitless. She didn't know how to answer the question because it was like, I don't know. And so he said something to the effect of, I wonder if it's because my wife and my two daughters would rather see me die on that white horse than fall off. And that just had such a profound impact on me. Because that is so much how I feel. And I'm like actually starting to sweat just thinking about it right now, because that is so much the narrative that I have in my life Even to this day, even after all the work and the unpacking and the transitioning and the realignment that I've done, I still think that sometimes that people would rather see me fucking die on this horse than fall off and make a mistake.
So I just want to speak to the horse analogy and that trope. So that's the hero riding in to save the day, right? And the idea being, I'd rather see you fall off that horse than not fall off the horse, die on the horse, doing the thing that I expect you to do as a man, rather than fall off and be needing something, hurt.
Right, needing help.
Vulnerable.
Showing a weakness of some sort. Yeah. And that speaks earlier to what you were talking about female identifying people having this expectation of men, right? Because it is intrinsic. It works hand in hand with each other. So I love that you shared that story. So thank you. But I wanted to expand on it because it had a huge impact on me.
Yeah.
And it had a massive impact on me. I read it in a different book, it sounds like, but it's still the same story. And it really was like, holy shit. Okay. I'm not alone.
So Greg, of all of her books, as impacting and influential as they have been on me as well, I would say this one, Men, Women, and Worthiness, is the one that struck me the most.
I'm going to check it out. I haven't read it.
Yeah.
I've read everything else by her, but not that one. So I'll definitely check it out. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up here. I will put a book list of recommended reading for people who are curious about this topic based upon the conversation that we've had, and anything else that you guys want to share with me that you've come across. That would be great. I think we have touched on some amazing personal stories and really hit home with what male vulnerability brings to the table in terms of offering people more intimacy, more connection, more self-realization, and what a gift that is to the world when we're able to do that, right? So thank you both. I really appreciate your contribution, Binyam. Thank you for being our guest today. Where can people find you?
Pleasure. You can find me on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok are the primary platforms that I frequent and post to. And if you just search my name, Binyam Asress, or at Binyam Asress, you'll be able to find me there. You can find me on Spotify as well. But that all houses my podcasts, my videos, my thoughts, reflections. Thank you for the opportunity to share.
Oh, it was fantastic.
Binyam, can you just spell your name for those that might be listening?
Absolutely. You need a doctorate to access it. Very simply, Binyam, Binyam, Ben and Yam together, Binyam. And my last name is Asress, Asress.
Great. And I just want to say thank you for showing up today. Thank you for sharing the stories. Thank you for being vulnerable with us and with our audience. And I see you.
Thank you. I find these kind of connections and friendships worth my investment because there's something beautiful that happens in the middle. And so I'm very grateful.
It's that licky stuff in the middle, right?
I love that analogy.
That was a horrible analogy, man. That was just so
it's the box of chocolates, though. It's perfect.
It's just so innuendo laden. Like it's just. I feel like it's perv levels of bad.
Oh no, it's great. I love it. I love it.
What came out of my head, so it's there. There for
and
the world.
It's there forever.
I was gonna say, it's there for the world to lick on, should they choose to. Whatever. Suck on it, lick on it. I don't give a shit.
Love it.
Oh, awesome. Thanks so much, you guys.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
And we're going to wrap it up with our usual. Okay, Greg, you ready?
I'm ready.
And remember,
choose love
and keep it kind.
We'd love to hear your comments, questions, or topic suggestions. And remember to subscribe.
And you're invited to join our Facebook group, Empowered Now Relationship Support and Advice for All.
You can reach out to us on our websites at gregmillion.com
and leannemillion.com.
Or follow us on Instagram at gregmillion.lifecoach.
And at Leanne Million.